All right, even if the markets take a tumble, a new report is highlighting certain sin industries. Sin, as in like bad.
Bad. Don't tell your mom.
Exactly. Axios says marijuana and sports betting could really stand out in 2019.
This comes as both industries continue to work to expand legalization across the country. Dan Primack is the business editor for Axios, and he joins us now. So tell us why that is. Why are we going to be more sinful in 2019? Why marijuana and sports betting?
Because they're getting more and more legalized. So sports betting over the summer, last summer, the Supreme Court basically struck down a law that had restricted it throughout the country outside of Nevada. And now you've got a nearly double-digit number of states which have already legalized it, and many, many more who are in the process of trying to figure out how to do it. That's all going to happen this year. And obviously, as you know, in terms of marijuana, the trend toward legalization has been increasing. There was more states that did so on the ballot last November, laws that went into effect this year. So you've got two industries. It's not that we are becoming more sinful. We are probably, you could say, becoming more sinful more legally. And thus, there's kind of, instead of kind of a black market industry around it, there is now more legitimate business around it and actual companies growing around it.
So there's been a rapid expansion in the marijuana industry, and companies have even listed on the stock market in 2018. You write that a lot of these new companies may fail, but it's not going to stop the rapid growth. Explain that trajectory of this industry.
Sure. So it's interesting. Most new industries, when you look back over time, have grown organically, right? There's maybe been a new invention or a new type of service, and things have grown relatively slowly. And other services, ancillary services, have built up around it over time. In this case, you've got products which are fairly mature, right? Marijuana isn't a new thing. Sports betting, or the idea of betting on a basketball game or football game, those aren't new. The products are old. It's the industries that are new. So what that means is you've got to have a massive amount of infrastructure and logistics build up kind of overnight around it. Now, that does mean you will have, kind of like any other startup industry, you'll have a bunch of failures. You'll have a bunch of fly-by-night, maybe folks who are looking to get rich quick. You already hear, if you listen to radio, you already hear, folks talking about, hey, get rich investing in marijuana stocks. There's obviously a lot of investor risk there, but overall, these are going to be large industries with big winners. And again, you need all these other services. Take marijuana, for example. Right now, most banks, if you run a marijuana dispensary, a legal one, you have a hard time getting a bank account, a business bank account, which, any other business has no problem getting. That's got to grow up. Delivery services, most big delivery companies won't deliver marijuana right now. That has to grow up.
So, as you know, because you point out in your article, this is the year that Canada legalized recreational marijuana, and they just did it right across the country. And so it solved some of these problems of, it being legal in one state and not illegal and federally, and all these sort of laws that contradict each other. Could this possibly be the year that we see marijuana become legalized across the country?
In Utah?
In the U.S., I have a hard time believing that, at least not with Donald Trump as president and probably with Barr becoming attorney general. But that said, you are not seeing, you don't seem at least to be seeing the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration really go into states in the U.S. which have legalized marijuana and really go after them. So, for example, I'm talking to you from Massachusetts, where recreational marijuana has now been legal for a couple months, and there are dispensaries popping up. To my knowledge, there haven't been any raids of those dispensaries. So I think it'll still be a state-by-state thing, but more and more and more states.
I want to get to sports betting, but real quick, I want to just touch on something that you said, because you talked about the difficulties in starting these businesses, and it must be even harder, for example, for African Americans and people of color to start a business in the marijuana industry. But on the other hand, they are incarcerated at a greater rate than white Americans for marijuana busts. How to reconcile that?
Yeah, well, look, it is, if you look at the data, it is generally harder for minorities to launch businesses, in part because of funding. And by the way, funding for this is also going to be very complicated, because if you think, if you're creating a software business or even a hotel chain or anything like that, the traditional sources of money for that, the traditional both venture capital and bank loans, those are still very hard to come by for marijuana, even from, say, venture capital firms in California, which is pretty liberal on marijuana law. A lot of them have what they call sin clauses. They can't invest in this stuff. So these can be very difficult businesses to start. And as you say, if you're a person in a demographic that already has a difficult time getting funding to start any business, that just exacerbates it.
So quickly, let's talk about sports betting. Became legal back in May because of a Supreme Court ruling. So are states expected to reap some big revenues from this? I think that, Atlantic City is really hoping to cash in and maybe resurrect the industry there because of this.
They are. There was an AP story yesterday or the day before which kind of tried to poo-poo this a little bit, suggested, in some of these states you might only be talking about 0.5% or 1% of, all tax revenue coming from sports betting. That's a really big deal. That's brand new revenue. That's not an increase. That's brand new. I think in some states it could be. It depends on how widespread it is. So, for example, the numbers seem to be fairly small in a state like Rhode Island, per capita, fairly small state like Rhode Island, but that's because Rhode Island hasn't really widespread legalized it. You can simply do it at a couple of physical facilities. You can't say pick up your phone if you're sitting in Woonsocket and bet on a game. In the states where you can do that and that are going to be pretty liberal in terms of how this works, I think it's going to be fairly substantial in terms of tax revenue. Also potentially in terms of jobs, as you don't necessarily need a physical sports book, but you do need some sort of physical presence usually in these states.
Dan Primack, love the shout out to Woonsocket, Rhode Island. I went to school there in Rhode Island. Good call on you. Thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Thanks for having me.